Um, I am going to chat to you a little bit about my own personal journey, about how I have come to a sort of extremely unexpected state of concluding we do need not only fundamental reform of our constitution, but extending that all the way to the top, including the monarchy. And then a few thoughts about kind of some of the things I think we need to do in terms of practicality of change. I have been on a little bit of a personal journey. I mean, I grew up as a classic middle class, pretty privileged um, southerner in Sussex. My parents were very conservative. We watched royal weddings. Um, don't all throw egg at the screen now, but my three brothers went to Eton, though all of them have done their best to distance themselves from that as far as possible since then. Um, I always had quite, I think, being the youngest of six kids, I was always somewhat of a revolutionary. I rebelled against power structures in my own family because I always got the leftovers and I always had to sit on the smallest chair or on the floor or in the back of the car. But nevertheless, I grew up in a fairly traditional household. And of course, I then joined the British Foreign Office and became a diplomat and was Her Majesty's ambassador and had the Queen's portrait on my wall. And um, I never ever thought that Britain was perfect, ever. I went to a fairly broad minded school that encouraged us to think about empire and poverty and power structures in the UK. So I always had a slightly different view than my parents and older members of my family. But I never thought the UK, but I still thought that overall the UK was generally a power for good in the world, that our political system, that generally it worked and that politicians sought power, generally motivated. Yes, you do have to have a certain amount of ego to seek power, but they, on the whole, were good chaps who tried to rule sensibly, if only because they wanted to get re-elected. And so it is fair to say that I, um, generally thought we were in a good place. And I've really been jolted out of my complacency, and I fully admit that it's complacency. And the sort of precipitating effect was Brexit, not because I thought it was absolutely immoral or illegal to want to leave the EU. Of course not. It's a voluntary union. One should be allowed to debate these things. What jolted me out of my complacency was the way in which Brexit was delivered, in that one party, the Conservatives, arrogated to themselves the unilateral power to decide how Brexit should be delivered, what the referendum meant, what kind of Brexit was the right one for the country, and basically squashed any national debate about how Brexit should be delivered, how to address and feel included in the process those who did not want to leave the EU, overrode the concerns of the Scots, who overwhelmingly voted to stay in the EU, um, were willing to play very fast and loose with a very delicate peace balance in Northern Ireland, which also had voted to stay in the EU, were willing to accuse judges of being enemies of the state for making rulings insisting that Parliament had more say in how Brexit was delivered, castigating whole swathes of the civil service for being allegedly a blob, and the whole way in which Brexit was delivered, culminating, of course, in the prorogation of Parliament to try and prevent Parliament scrutinising the Brexit deal. And that process is what eventually triggered my own decision to resign as a British diplomat, because I was the Brexit counsellor in Washington, charged with explaining Brexit to American audiences. And I was being given what we call lines to take or points to make, the sort of narrative that I had to draw on that were basically untrue. And I was not prepared to do it. So that whole process was extremely disillusioning, and it caused me. And then you had 2 years after that of all the sort of continuing scandals and abuse of power under Boris Johnson, and that whole process led me to think, how is it that our power structures in the UK are so weak? Why don't we have more guardrails in our democracy? How can it be that one party can exercise power so irresponsibly, so dishonestly, and so unaccountably? Where are the guardrails of our democracy? So I started writing and tweeting about these things. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw how in Parliament, the sort of home of democracy, the Westminster model, it gives disproportionate influence to the majority power, to the majority party, which of course is elected on a first past the post system, which of course tends to skew the result and allow one party that has won less than 40% of the popular vote, overwhelming majority year after year in our elections. So it made me question our electoral system. It made me question how power is, because then you're reliant on this sort of two-party system effectively. One party holds the balance of power consistently. Our executive then can rely upon that inbuilt majority. And there are very few checks on our executive. So in the last few years, we've seen the Tory party increasingly use Henry VIII powers, meaning they pass legislation which doesn't go through the full scrutiny and the full measure of debate in the House of Commons and can be implemented with successive regulations that the government doesn't need to pass through the Commons at all. So they've made more use of secondary legislation rather than primary legislation, which gets more scrutiny. They've made greater use of Henry VIII powers. So I realised that Parliament wasn't that correct check. We do have a House of Lords, but the upper chamber ultimately can only delay legislation. It can scrutinise it and it can recommend improvements, but ultimately it cannot override the will of the House of Commons. For obvious reasons, it's not an elected chamber. Then we've seen how the House of Lords is also a form of patronage through the conferring of peerages to political party donors or to press barons, or in one memorable case, to the son of a KGB agent who Boris Johnson nominated over the objections of MI5. So our system allows for patronage through the peerage system. Then I realized that this was also in a very unhealthy crony relationship with the executive and the prime minister's office. We've seen this revolving door of Sun journalists, Telegraph journalists, Daily Mail journalists being recruited into Number 10 as press advisors or communications officers. And you've had politicians or retiring politicians then being paid to be columnists or appear on TV for those same media outlets. So the press is not truly independent in our country. And so I sort of, then we don't have a Supreme Court, whereas in the UK, in the US, for example, you have a written constitution, which of course we don't have in the UK. The law is whatever the Parliament of the day decides it wants it to be. And we don't have a written constitution that acts as a sort of ultimate arbiter of behavior and the rule of law. We don't have a Supreme Court, and our government has been trying to has passed laws limiting the powers of judicial review. So our judiciary can't act as a check on the executive either. And so that led me steadily up the sort of chain of command until it took me to the monarchy, because in many other countries you then have a president that acts as a check on the prime minister or the government. But in our system, because we have an unelected monarch, a hereditary position, the monarch also has no ability to act as a check on the powers of the executive. And in fact, the monarch is part of what I would call an unhealthy triad of monarch, power, press. They are all in a fairly crony relationship. The press gets more followers and clickbait on its news stories when it writes about the royal family, which everybody loves to click on and read. For our politicians, it's a wonderful distraction from actual more pressing problems in our country. Also, political parties can exploit the monarchy to appeal to patriotism and try and make critics imply that they are not patriotic. And then, of course, the monarchy is a drain on the public purse, although that is not my fundamental objection to the monarchy. My fundamental objection to the monarchy is because of the way it fits into our complete lack of a constitutional system. It has no purpose or point. That is what has led me ultimately to decide that if we want to reform our country's systems, we have to reform everything about it. We can't just tinker at the margins. You can't just tinker with the House of Lords, though that is in some ways the most visible and egregious weakness in our political system, because the House of Lords, it partly derives its status from the fact that we have a king, a queen, prince, princesses. That's why we can get away with having dukes and duchesses and lords and ladies and barons. So that is the journey that has brought me to where I am today, thinking that if we want to make our system more democratic, if we want to introduce more accountability into our system, and if we want to make our political system more transparent, we can't just tinker with individual bits of it. We need root and branch reform of our system, and that means starting at the top.